Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal, and this is the second lecture for your Week 6, Chapter 6 selection. In this video, we're going to talk about different types of selection methods. The first is intelligence tests. These are also known as tests of cognitive ability, and an example is the Wonderlic Personnel Test. These intelligence tests say that they measure G, or general mental ability. So G is another way of saying general cognitive ability, which is another way of saying general intelligence. The authors who came up with the concept of G, or who researched the concept of G, basically said that you can measure all different types of intelligence. And the way that someone scores on any one type of intelligence is correlated with an overall general mental ability. And so they say that you can assess this overall general mental ability, and they also related it to work performance. So what do you think? Do you think that G is important at work? Do you think that general mental ability or cognitive ability or intelligence is related to job performance? In other words, do you think that as cognitive ability increases or people have more intelligence, their propensity to do well on the job increases? The answer is generally yes. So criterion-related validity for job performance is as high as 0.4 to 0.6. So do you remember from our last video what I said a strong correlation was? So a strong correlation is around 0.5. And so you can see that this 0.4 to 0.6 range is indeed a strong positive correlation between G and job performance. So in other words, as general mental ability goes up, job performance goes up, and that is a strong positive relationship. So in general, yes, we have criterion-related validity for general mental ability predicting job performance. However, it's not necessarily across the board. So can you think of any jobs for which having more intelligence is not necessarily important for job performance? So you might be thinking of jobs that are fairly routine. For instance, some types of manufacturing jobs. If you're doing the same activity over and over again and you're more using your physical abilities than your mental abilities, then perhaps cognitive ability is not as important for that job. And you would be correct. So this general mental ability criterion-related validity is an average across all different types of jobs. So on average, it does relate to job performance. However, we do see some differences depending on the type of job, and certainly more complex jobs benefit more from higher levels of intelligence. All right, so here is an example on slide 15 of a type of question that would be asked on a test like the Wonderlic Personnel Test or other tests of intelligence. Paper is to scissors as wood is to, and the correct answer would be B, saw. So are there any problems with intelligence test results for selection? There are. So one is that intelligence tests tend to demonstrate what we call adverse impact, and we're going to talk more about that in Chapter 7. But essentially, what adverse impact is referring to is that a test results in different scores based on different groups of people. And those different scores relate to some groups of people getting hired at a higher rate than others. So for some groups of minority individuals and women will tend to score lower on these tests of G, or general mental ability. And there's a lot of conversation and debate as to why that is, and there could be, for instance, cultural loading of items on these intelligence tests that causes that. But the ultimate result is that it can result in essentially some groups like white men getting hired at a higher rate than women. So that we need to be careful when we are using intelligence tests for selection. And they are certainly valid, but we cannot just use intelligence tests. They cannot be our only type of tests that we're using or method of selection that we're using. We need to use them in combination with other things. Personality tests are another type of test. And these are different than intelligence tests in that there is no right or wrong answer on personality test questions. And for that reason, some people would refer to personality tests as inventories or personality inventories rather than tests. These often measure something called the Big Five personality dimensions. The Big Five personality dimensions are dimensions of personality that have been validated by psychologists over the course of many, many years. So you may see tests of personality online that are not the Big Five. More than likely, those haven't been validated. So they're fun to take and to, just for fun, but they are not tests that you would use in an organization for hiring because they haven't been validated. The Big Five, on the other hand, has been validated, and so we can use those for hiring. The Big Five dimensions include openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And if you look down the left-hand side of these five personality dimensions, you'll see that the acronym OCEAN comes up, right? So that's one way that you can remember the Big Five personality dimensions. Openness to experience is referring to a creativity and a willingness to try new things and an appreciation for the arts. Conscientiousness refers to being very diligent and detail-oriented. Extroversion refers to being very sociable and having high energy. Agreeableness refers to how much someone is willing to agree with others and get along with other individuals. And neuroticism is the degree to which someone's emotions tend to fluctuate and may have a tendency to experience high levels of negative affect. Other personality constructs that have been validated by psychologists that are outside of this Big Five personality include proactive personality. So this is referring to the ability to think ahead and to plan for things, and that is related to job performance. Adaptability, or the ability to be flexible and to change when needed at work. Emotional intelligence. So this is referring to the ability to recognize emotions in oneself and in other people, and to use that information in decision making. And finally, core self-evaluations. So this is a global construct that is comprised of these four different sub-constructs. So self-esteem, locus of control, self-efficacy, and neuroticism. Here are some sample questions that would go along with the Big Five characteristics. So for each, the person would be asked to indicate for each statement whether it is very inaccurate, moderately inaccurate, neither accurate nor inaccurate, moderately accurate, or very accurate, as a description of you at work. So openness to experience, am interested in abstract ideas. Conscientiousness, am always prepared. Extroversion, am the life of the party. Agreeableness, sympathize with others' feelings. And neuroticism, change my mood a lot. These sample questions were taken from something called the IPIP, the International Personality Item Pool. And there's a link here. If you're ever doing research with a professor in a lab, you may be looking for personality test questions. This is a great place to get them because they are freely available. You don't have to pay for them. In a lot of cases, you will have to pay for personality tests, and organizations do have to pay typically for personality test questions. But if you're a student or a researcher and you need some questions, this is a great place to go. All right, so in terms of the Big Five characteristics, only one of those five has been consistently linked to job performance across many different types of jobs. So can you take a guess as to which one that is? So let's look back. Do you think it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, or neuroticism? So if you said conscientiousness, you would be correct. Conscientiousness is the only one of the five that has been consistently linked to job performance across many, many different types of jobs. All right, so which other construct do you think is related to performance in managers and salespeople? So let's again look back. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, or neuroticism? If you said extroversion, you would be correct. What is an advantage of using personality testing? Well, one advantage that kind of gets at the problem that I mentioned earlier with intelligence testing is that personality testing is not subject to adverse impact. So, in terms of using these tests, there is less concern about creating discrimination against any one group by using the results. What is a potential pitfall of using personality testing? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that these things can be easily faked or are lied about, right? So if I am taking a personality test and I know that it's for a sales job and they're really looking for people who are extroverted, then I can simply answer my questions in that way. That wouldn't be, very ethical on my part, but it's certainly something that can happen. And so test developers have come up with ways to try to mitigate the faking that is involved with personality testing. Integrity tests are another type of test, and these have been developed to predict negative and counterproductive employee behaviors. So you may remember back from our criteria chapter that counterproductive behaviors are those that go against the goals of the organization. These include things like theft, so stealing office supplies, for example, drug use or aggression. And so integrity tests are designed to try to assess people in terms of who will do these types of things so that they won't be selected into the job. There are two main types. One is overt, and a question would be I would hit someone if they insulted me. And then covert, which is I look for excitement and thrills at work. You can see just looking at these that there's probably the high risk of people faking and lying on these types of questions as well. But they, some people do respond positively to questions, even overt questions. So organizations still use them. And their criterion related validity for predicting counterproductive work behaviors is 0.47. So again, thinking back to the last video where I explained what the different correlation values mean, you can see that 0.47 is a strong positive correlation. So someone who scores high on a question like I would hit someone if they insulted me is more likely to then display counterproductive behaviors once they get hired in the job. Another selection method is interviews, and these are the most commonly used methods of selecting job candidates. Pretty much everyone has been through an interview, or if you haven't, then you will be at some point in your career. So what do we do when we're creating interviews? We determine KSAOs, so we can assess the levels of knowledge someone has, their skills, their experience, their other characteristics like their personality. We can also provide candidates with realistic job previews during the interviews. And what this is referring to is providing the candidate with an idea of exactly what the job is going to be like. And that's been found to be very helpful because people need to have a good idea of what it's going to be in order to make an informed decision about whether they want to work there or not. So the interview is a great opportunity for that to happen. And finally, to learn about fit. So is the organization looking for a specific skill set or level of experience or personality? And if so, does that person fit what the organization is looking for? And vice versa. So the candidate might be looking for a very specific role and job duties and organizational culture, and they can determine that in part during the interview process. All right, so the interviews can be helpful, right? But what are some problems with interviews? So think for a second about what problems might exist with interviews. So some of the problems are listed here. First impressions are likely to make a huge impact during interviews, and not everyone is good at giving first impressions, right? So someone who does not give a very good first impression, they may actually be really good on the job, but it's hard to determine that during an interview, and so that's a problem. Also, similarity and likability biases. So remember those from our last chapter. If a person is more similar to the interviewer, then the interviewer is more likely to like them and to want to hire them. Now, that becomes a real problem, right? Because if the managers in the organization, for instance, all tend to be white, they may subconsciously prefer white candidates. They may not be consciously aware of this, but it can happen. And adverse impact is another thing that can come up. So how can we improve the interview? So we basically add structure to the interview in order to improve it. So in an unstructured interview, this is similar to a casual conversation, such that different applicants could be asked very different questions, and some of which may not be job related. On the other hand, a structured interview is more valid, and this is when job applicants are all asked the same job-related questions, and the interviewers use standardized rating scales, similar to the behavioral anchored rating scale that you created for your last module. Multiple raters are used so that you can mitigate the potential for bias from any one rater. And also, people should take notes during the interview so that they can not just rely on their memory, but they can have notes to refer back to. So the results of structured interviews are much more valid for predicting who's going to perform well on the job than unstructured interviews. And if there's only one thing that you take away from this entire chapter, I would love it to be that structured interviews are much better than unstructured interviews. And if you're ever in a hiring position in an organization, implement structure when you're interviewing your candidates. There are different interview types that go along with structured interviews, and we're going to talk about two of them. The first is a situational interview, and this is when an interviewer asks hypothetical job-related questions, and all applicants are asked the same questions, of course. And behavioral interviews, on the other hand, ask job-related questions about a past experience that the applicant had. So they're very similar, and the behavioral interview is asking the person to talk about past experiences, whereas the situational interview is asking them hypothetically what they would do in that situation. So they're slightly different. So if the job, for instance, is a customer service specialist, a situational interview item could be a customer calls who is angry about a defective product and begins yelling at you. What would you do? So again, this is asking what the person would do in that situation hypothetically. Behavioral interview question would be explain about a time that you had to deal with an angry customer who was yelling at you. What did you do? So again, it's focusing on the experience that the person has. The next slide gives some more examples of situational interviews and an example scale for interpreting responses. And kind of moving on to a different type of method for selection, work samples and related tests assess how well an applicant does the actual job. And these are highly valid for predicting job performance as well, as you could imagine. So methods include work samples and simulations. This is where candidates are given the equipment and are asked to do the job tasks. One example that I will give you is if a person is being hired for a job of coding in an organization. So perhaps they are being hired for a position of software developer or coder in an organization. During the situational work sample, I should say, they would be given something to do, a coding task, and they would be asked to create the code to go along with that. And then the people who were hiring would go and check it to see how they did with that task. Assessment centers are another type of work sample, but they're mainly for managerial positions. So positions where the individual will be managing other people. And these include things like an in-basket exercise, which is when the job candidate is given a lot of different things to do at one time, and they can see how the candidate decides which one they're going to do first and second and third and how they go about solving those problems. And that kind of replicates what managers face on a day-to-day basis. They have a lot of different things that they have to deal with, and how do they prioritize and how do they decide what gets done and in what way. Another type of exercise that happens in an assessment center is role play. So someone could play the role of a manager and the other person could play a role of subordinate, and they could go through scenarios. Another is a leaderless group discussion. A group could discuss something, and the people who are assessing performance would maybe see who emerges as a leader in that group. So assessment centers, to kind of recap, are these types of things usually done off-site, so in another situation, another context, where multiple candidates are brought in to be assessed for managerial positions, and they go through these different types of exercises. And at the end of the day, the individuals who are running the assessment centers kind of look at how they've done through all these different activities and create reports for the organization, and they give those reports to the organization as to how the individual did. IO psychologists are very commonly employed in assessment centers, and oftentimes entry-level IO people will go in and be assessors. They'll watch how people are doing in these assessment centers and help write reports. Situational judgment tests are the last type of method here, and these put a candidate in a work-related situation and ask what they think is the correct action to take. So these are different from work samples or simulations in that they're not actually doing something. They're not showing their skills directly. They're talking about how they would handle that particular situation. And that can be in video format or a written format. So a candidate could watch a video about a situation and then respond as to how they would act in that situation, or it could be a written situation that they go through and answer that in that way. Some advantages of work samples and related tests are that they are realistic. So oftentimes the candidate is doing things or talking about things that would actually happen on their job. As opposed to something like a personality test, it's like closer to what the actual job is. And for that reason, they tend to have face validity. So remember that face validity is referring to how much the candidate feels that what they're going through for selection is relevant to the actual job and fair. And so it's pretty fair, I think, it can be perceived as pretty fair to ask someone to actually demonstrate how they would do the job. That seems like a fair method of selection. And then another advantage is the criterion-related validity, like I mentioned earlier. How someone performs on work samples and assessment centers and situational judgment tests does tend to predict job performance after someone is hired. All right, so some disadvantages are that these methods can be costly and time-intensive, especially assessment centers. So they're not something that you can do for every candidate, especially for lower types of positions in an organization. And also that they can show some adverse impact. Training raters is really important to try to reduce adverse impact and trying to help them mitigate some of the biases that can occur. Biodata is another selection method, and this is referring to information that applicants provide about their employment history and background. And this is very common. So if you've ever filled out a job application, you've probably given an organization some of your biodata. And this includes education, past work, and life experiences. And companies use ones that have been found to be valid for predicting job performance. And interestingly, this can also be used as a competitive advantage for organizations. So for example, Google is known to use biodata. And they use some uncommon types of biodata questions that they have found predict job performance, but they may not be seen as especially relevant to the job. And I'll come back to this in just a moment. So Biodata items could include, for instance, how many jobs have you held in the last 5 years? And what that might be trying to get at is the employee likely to leave your company? Are they likely to turn over? Another question would be list any sports that you have played in school related to the job you're applying for. This could predict job performance in a sporting goods store. These things are relevant for the things that they're predicting. But companies do need to be careful about using biodata. So from an ethical perspective, making sure that they're not inadvertently asking questions that will weed certain people out unfairly. So here's an example. If a company were to ask an employee whether they grew up with a computer in their home, so that might, say something about the employee's age, right? First of all, if you're much older, you are much less likely to have a computer in your home. But also, it says something about socioeconomic status. So if an applicant comes from a very poor background, they may not have had a computer growing up in their home. So even though this type of question may be well-intentioned by the organization, so they might be trying to get at like whether the person is likes to be around computers and perhaps they may think that it's valid for hiring someone to work in a computer store or a computer organization. They have to be careful that it's not inadvertently revealing something like age or ability status or race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status, and making sure that doesn't happen. Let's talk about reference checks and letters. So many employees use some kind of reference or background check to screen their employees. And this is often used to verify information or avoid applicants with so-called red flags. So this happens a lot for graduate school. Students are asked to get letters of reference from professors or from employers, and those are used during the screening process. It's also used in organizations. However, the validity of reference checks in relation to work performance is generally low. So why do you think that is? Why do you think the validity of it is low? Well, one reason is that people tend to be overwhelmingly positive in their reference check letters or when they're talking about a candidate on the phone. So if you think about it, a candidate is not likely to ask someone who doesn't really like them to do a letter for them or a reference for them. They are likely to only use people who would speak positively about them. So if everyone's getting really good reference checks or really good letters, then you can't really differentiate between people, so the validity is fairly low. All right, in terms of physical ability tests, these measure things like muscular strength, endurance or stamina, and physical skill in movements or coordination, like hand-eye coordination. These are used for selecting firefighters, police officers, and other people for whom physical ability is an important part of the job. So men tend to perform better on tests of strength. So this can result in some adverse impact against women. This is maybe a reason that it's critical that physical ability requirements are in fact job related. So if physical ability requirements are job related, then it is okay if the test discriminates against people who are not able to display that amount of strength. So that's one example where credit reports are a controversial type of selection method. About half of U.S. employers use credit checks as part of their selection process. What are some potential issues with this? Well, if you kind of thought that maybe they wouldn't be seen as face valid, then that would be correct. People might be wondering, what the heck does my credit have to do with how well I'm going to perform on the job? So some states have banned this practice. Research does show that credit scores correlate positively with conscientiousness. Credit scores predict some types of job performance, but they do not predict CWBs. Adverse impact is definitely a problem with credit reports. So organizations really need to be careful in the use of their credit reports. And you can probably think of a lot of situations in which someone is really conscientious and would be actually a very good employee, but maybe they have bad credit. People go through rough times in their life in terms of financial distress. And these are things that are often out of the person's control. For instance, if you have a medical issue that comes up and you don't have health insurance, that can destroy your credit. If you lose a job and your house, goes into foreclosure or something, that can be very harmful to your credit. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to not perform on the job well. So I would always recommend that organizations use credit reports very judiciously. The final thing that we'll talk about in terms of selection method is social media. So many employers look at job candidates' social media posts during the hiring process, up to 70% from what I've seen. So I want you to think about what some potential issues are that you see with this for candidates and for employers. And this is also related to your discussion that you're doing for this week. So take some time to really think about what some of the issues are there and respond in your discussion post.